Welcome. This video covers subsetting variables or columns in SAS. We're trying to talk about some of these very common data manipulations that you might do in SAS. Well, one thing that you often want to do is remove some of the columns from your data set in order to make your program more efficient and for the code to run a little bit faster. There are two ways to do that in a data step that we'll cover, and those are using either the drop or keep statement or drop or keep data set options. Again, the idea here is I might have a data set with multiple columns or multiple variables, and what I want to do is just select a couple of those that I care about for the particular analysis or particular reports, whatever that I'm doing at this particular moment in time. We can either use drop to select which variables to remove, or we can use keep to just state which variables we want to keep. And again, you can either use a statement for each one of these, just like we saw with label and rename, or you can use dataset options. And the behavior on those are exactly the same as before. The dataset option copies before, whereas dataset option changes before copy, and the statement changes after copy. Let's look at an example where we might do this kind of thing. There is a file available on the web that you can download. This is called Fandango_scrape. And we're going to read that into our NCSU library. So I've set up my library here at the top. Again, your numbers there are going to be different than my numbers. We're creating a file name reference called Fandango, and we're reading this from the URL. So we're specifying I'm going to read this from the web, and I'm going to use proc import to read that data set in. I'm going to read it into my NCSU library as a data set called Fandango. All right. Hopefully that's not too scary for you at this point in time, and you can understand all of that code that we're going through. Here's what the data set actually looks like once we read it in. We can see there's only a couple columns here, so this is just a little toy data set that we can play around with here. But we have film, so this is information on movies from 2015 and 2016. We have film, we have the stars given by, I think, the website, and then rating given by an average of some critics, or the viewer ratings. And then there's a number of votes based associated with that rating. Okay. How do we select different kinds of columns to continue on with? Well, again, we could use a drop statement or drop dataset option. Drop tells SAS which variables to get rid of. And so if I'm going to go and copy over my dataset here, I'm going to create a new variable or a new dataset called Fandango drop. And I'm just going to use a drop statement to say, well, I want to drop or get rid of the votes and ratings columns. That's all you got to do to get rid of those columns. Again, with statements, all of the dataset, the entire dataset is copied into the data step, and then we drop the variables at the end. So we still have access to votes and ratings during the data step when we do it this way. Alternatively, we can use the drop dataset option, and when we do it this way, we have to use that different syntax, just like we saw with the rename and label statements. We put a parenthesis, and then we can put the dataset options that we want next. And so remember, with this, the behavior is different. We drop these variables before we copy. And so I do not have access to votes, and I do not have access to the rating column once I'm in my data step. So if I wanted to use those for anything, I'm not going to be able to when I do it this method. But this is going to require less computer memory and things like that because it's dropping the variables before it's doing the copy. So you could see how with a very large data set, this could be very important. Likewise, we have a keep statement, which is kind of the opposite of drop, right? It's just going to tell SAS which variables do I want to keep. The keep statement, just like we did before, we're going to just list the variables out that we want. Again, this is going to do the changes. It's going to do the keeping of the variables after the data step is over. Alternatively, we can use the keep dataset option. Again, the syntax is different. We put our dataset options in parentheses after the dataset in the set statement. And here we're just going to say keep equal film and rating. Not too bad. Just like before, this is going to do the copying after it's done the keep. So we're going to only keep those variables and then copy over our data set. You might be asking yourself, well, why are there two options? And when would I use drop versus using keep? Well, basically, you just choose which one is more convenient. Whichever one's going to require you to do less typing overall. If you had 50 variables, for instance, and you wanted to end up with a data set that had 35 variables, you'd probably use drop because then you only have to list out 15 variables. If you had 50 variables and you wanted to switch to 10 variables, so you want to drop 40 of them, You don't want to list all 40 variables out when you could use a keep and just list out 10. Really, it's just about convenience. Let's go ahead and jump into SAS and check out how we can utilize the drop and keep statements and dataset options to change our variables that we have in our dataset. Here we are back in SAS, ready to use our drop and keep dataset options and statements. And we're going to continue this previous program that we wrote. And up here, we were dealing with this wine dataset that had a number of variables. And first we changed the names of them because we didn't like having that space in there, and then we gave them some nice labels. Well, we might also want to drop some of these variables that maybe we're not going to use in whatever analysis that we're doing. We could write a separate data step and do the things that we wanted to do there, or we could just add to the previous data step that we had. We're going to go ahead and add to the previous data step. In this case, I'm going to use a dataset option to drop some of my variables. So I'm just going to list out a couple variables that I no longer want. Again, this is going to happen prior to copy. If I want to use a dataset option, it has to be within this parenthesis that you see here because that's where all of our dataset options are going to go. So this is the one that ends it for rename. I'm going to go ahead and hit return. I deleted my parenthesis. I'm going to space in just for readability. And now I'm going to use my drop dataset option. And again, SAS Studio is helping me out. It says, use drop equal if you want the syntax for this. And then you just list out the variables that you want to drop within there. And so we're going to drop, let's go ahead and just drop the type variable and maybe the pH variable. We'll run that code and print it out just like we did before. Great, it finished running here. We always want to check our log though anytime that we're dealing with running code. So we go up here to our data step that we changed a little bit. We don't see any errors or warnings, so that's a good sign. If we go back to our results, we can see here that we had dropped our pH variable and our type variable, and when we look at our results, we no longer have type, we no longer have pH involved there. So dropping those variables did work and maybe helps us deal with less data and less storage for our data set moving forward. To recap, we now have a couple of common ways to manipulate our columns. We can rename them, we can label them, and we can also drop or keep certain variables that we want. Remember that there is this differing behavior between statements and dataset options. And what we're going to do next is look at how to create new variables that we might want to add to our dataset.